long before the pyramids rose along the Nile, before the palaces of Babylon shone beneath desert suns. A quieter miracle was unfolding on the banks of two winding rivers. Between the Tigris and the Euphrates lay a flat, fertile plain, Mesopotamia. It was not the easiest place to live. The rivers could flood without warning, sweeping away huts and fields, or run dry, leaving cracked earth behind. Yet, in this uncertain land, human beings built something the world had never seen before: civilization itself. Around 6,000 years ago, scattered villages of farmers began to grow into towns. Their barley fields shimmered under the sun. Their sheep grazed along canals they had cut by hand. Slowly, walls of mud brick rose above the flat horizon. Temples, called ziggurats, reached toward the heavens like stairways for the gods. Here, in these city-states, Uruk, Lagash humans first learned to live in great numbers, not merely as families or clans, but as organized societies. For the first time in history, people wrote their words into clay. They pressed reeds into wet tablets, leaving marks we now call cuneiform. With these signs, they counted grain, recorded laws, and sang hymns to gods of sky and storm. Time itself began here. The Sumerians divided the hour into 60 minutes, the circle into 360 degrees. Patterns still echoing in every clock and compass we hold today. But beyond invention lay something deeper. These ancient people were dreamers. They imagined gods who shaped men from clay, heroes who battled monsters, and a flood that once swallowed the earth. Their myths would pass down through millennia, whispering into the stories of later peoples: the Babylonians, the Hebrews, even us. Tonight, we will journey back to where it all began, to walk the streets of Uruk, to watch the first scribes at work, to listen to the prayers rising from a temple tower. We will fall asleep to the story of the Sumerians, the world's oldest civilization. At first, the land was only water and light. Dawn laid a pale ribbon across the plain, and mist rose from the channels like the breath of sleeping animals. In the hush between bird calls and footsteps, two old rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, unwound themselves across the earth. They wandered. They flooded. They forgot their beds and carved new ones. Between them stretched a flat, silty world that held a secret. The mud here could be shaped. People came with baskets and hope. They were not yet Sumerians in their own minds. They were families who remembered dry years and sudden torrents. They brought seeds saved in gourds, goats that tugged at their ropes, and the memory of a simple prayer: let the water rise, but not too high. They learned the logic of the flood. When the rivers spilled, they left behind a skin of dark silt that took the seed and doubled it. When they withdrew, the ground cracked like pottery. The answer was neither in fear nor in luck, but in labor. So they dug. A canal began as a line drawn in dust, then a trench, then a ditch braced with reed mats. Men and women moved earth with woven baskets. Children stamped the walls firm with bare feet. Water obeyed. Fields greened. Barley stood up like an army, each stalk carrying a promise in its head. In time, the canals multiplied like veins. and the plain learned to pulse with seasons measured not only by the sky, but by sluice gates, embankments, and the timing of a careful hand. Mud, too, was persuaded into new shapes. First came bricks, sun-dried, straw-bound, stamped with the mark of a family. From bricks rose walls low at first, to keep out the wind and stray cattle, then higher, to hold a roof against sudden storms. Roofs were woven reed and mud, a kind of soft armor against the weather. Houses gathered around a shared open space where ovens glowed and pots hissed and laughter ran like a small river of its own. What turns a cluster of houses into a town is not only population, but agreement. The Sumerian plain learned the art of agreement early. Who would decide when the canal gate should open? And whose field would drink first? Who would repair a breach when night rains came? The answer took a sacred form. In the middle of the settlement rose a platform of stepped mud brick. At first modest, then taller, a temple terrace. The house of a god who loved order in water and grain. Priests, with their heads shaved smooth, kept tablets of tallies, stored offerings, poured libations, and perhaps most important, oversaw the calendar of work: seed time, harvest, repair. On market days, the flat square near the temple thrummed. Reed baskets held onions and dates, barley flour and dried fish. Potters brought jars with bellies like moons. Shepherds came with fleece and cheese. Boatmen with bright lapis from far mountains, and resin that smelled of distant pines. A clay ceiling would be pressed with a cylinder seal, a tiny carved roll that left a procession of animals or heroes marching around the surface. With one gesture, a trader said, "This is mine, and I stand behind it." Trust had found a tool. Evenings were for beer barley turned to a friendly brown drink, sipped through long straws from a common jar. It softened the day's edges and made songs come easier. Music rose from lyres with bull-headed soundboxes, from flutes cut from reed. The songs praised Nana in Ur, Inanna in Uruk, Enki in Eridu, gods who were both near and vast, as intimate as the breeze on a cheek and as large as the storm that could flatten a harvest. Yet life was not all ritual and trade. There were small dramas that never made it to tablets. A girl traded a string of shells for a polished bead and wore it home, proud. An old man taught a boy to read the canal's color, greenish and slow, meant silt enough to feed the fields. Grey and fast meant danger and a night of shouting along the embankment. A midwife washed her hands in warm water and welcomed a new voice to the chorus that was building these towns into something with a name. The land answered to careful hands, but it also kept its temper. Some years the rivers bit deep into their banks and ran away from the old channels, leaving fields thirsty and work gangs tired. Other years they clawed their way inland, toppling walls and burying ovens in wet silt. Each time, the people adjusted a little more. They strengthened a levee here, shifted a field there, learned which reeds held best, which knots in rope would not fail in the rain. Civilization, at its root, is this 1,000 practical decisions repeated until they become tradition? Around these decisions, stories gathered like swallows at dusk. If the river changed course, perhaps a god had taken offense. If the barley failed, perhaps A ritual needed mending. So, myth stitched itself into schedule, and duty into devotion. The temple stair became a ladder between worlds. Men carried baskets of offerings up, and hope came down in the form of fair weather and steady water. Some evenings, when the breeze slackened and the reed beds stood still, a stranger arrived by boat, his clothes dusty with travel, his hands stained with lapis dust. He spoke of a place downriver where the houses climbed higher than birds, where the temple's shadow reached noon even in winter, where a king of Uruk had set his name upon stone. The listeners leaned in. Distance had a taste then, like salt on the lip. Here, on this plain, something quiet and irreversible was happening. Work calendars needed memory longer than any single day. Exchange required proof that outlived a handshake. The temple storeroom demanded more than the priest's word, and in a house of cool brick, where a lamp smoked faintly and a jar of barley beer waited for morning, a boy took a reed stylus, pressed its tip into soft clay, and made a mark. The rivers had learned to answer gates and walls. Now the clay would learn to answer thought. In the next chapter, the marks will multiply, and a city called Uruk will teach the world how to speak with signs that do not fade with the breath. The travelers' tales had not lied. Beyond the flat horizon, Uruk rose like a miracle of mud and sun. At its heart, a ziggurat towered above the plain, its terraces painted with white gypsum, gleaming against the sky. From a distance, the temple seemed like a mountain sculpted by human will, a stairway for gods to descend and men to climb. Around it stretched walls so massive that legend would later claim they were built by Gilgamesh himself. The walls held not just houses, but an idea that life could be organized on a scale far greater than family or village. Uruk was the beating heart of early civilization. By 3000 BC, perhaps 50,000 souls crowded its streets, an unimaginable number in a world where most people still lived in hamlets of a few dozen. Here, lanes echoed with the creak of carts and the cries of traders. Dust swirled under the hooves of donkeys laden with jars of dates, while barges unloaded reeds, timber, and stone at the quays of the Euphrates. The air was thick with smoke from kilns and ovens. The smell of drying fish, the tang of new-cut barley. In Uruk, humanity invented the city, but the city demanded more than walls. It demanded memory. How else to track 100 measures of grain owed to the temple? Or to record a shipment of wool to a distant land? At first, little clay tokens sufficed, tiny cones and spheres pressed into envelopes of clay, sealed with a sign. Yet tokens multiplied too quickly. The human mind strained to remember what each meant. Then came a quiet revolution, marks pressed directly into clay. Signs that stood for numbers, for goods, eventually for sounds. Cuneiform was born first as accountancy, then as poetry. Imagine a scribe in a dim room, the light of an oil lamp trembling on the wall. He holds a reed stylus, its tip triangular from being cut with a sharp blade. He leans over a soft clay tablet and presses wedge after wedge, careful as a farmer sowing seeds. When finished, he lifts the tablet, still damp, and sets it near the hearth to harden. On it is written more than barley tallies a hymn to Inanna, the goddess of love and war. Her name caught forever in clay. For the first time in human history, words outlast breath. Writing transformed the city. Laws could be recorded, treaties preserved, myths sung by one generation and read by another. Priests and officials gained new authority as keepers of tablets. The temple itself became not only a house of gods, but a treasury, a granary, a school. Young boys, training as scribes, practiced by copying lists of animals or proverbs, do not speak arrogantly to your mother, she gave you birth. In such lines, the city whispered both wisdom and order. Uruk also invented kingship. A ruler was needed to marshal labor for walls, canals, and temples. He wore a long robe, a headdress of wool, and sat upon a throne carved of cedar brought from mountains far away. His authority was twofold, earthly, to command soldiers and workers, divine, to offer sacrifices and keep favor with the gods. In later times, poets would make kings larger than life, none more so than Gilgamesh. 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, whose epic journey to seek immortality still haunts us today. The scale of Uruk demanded art. Cylinder seals, carved with intricate scenes of banquets and battles, left their traces on wet clay like tiny signatures of beauty. Pottery bore painted bands of black and red. Lyres with golden bullheads played at feasts where barley beer foamed in tall jars. And on the temple terraces, priestesses in bright linen robes sang hymns that curled like smoke toward the stars. Yet the city's greatness carried shadows. Crowded streets bred disputes whose donkeys strayed into whose field, whose debt was unpaid, whose roof beam fell and injured a neighbor. Epidemics sometimes swept through the dense quarters. And beneath the city's walls, rival settlements watched, envious or fearful, sharpening weapons of flint and bronze. Civilization was both miracle and burden. Still, Uruk endured, and with it, the idea that human beings could build something larger than themselves, something that reached toward eternity. In its streets, the first epic poems stirred. The first laws took root. The first kings dreamed of immortality. It was here that civilization crossed a threshold it would never return from. When the sun set behind the ziggurat, shadows fell across streets, buzzing with life. The lamps of scribes still flickered. Merchants counted their silver, and a priest ascended the temple steps with an offering of bread and beer. Above, stars lit the desert sky, silent witnesses to a truth as old as the city, that words, once written, endure beyond the voice, and cities, once dreamed, endure beyond the dreamer. When the sun rose over the mud-brick walls of a Sumerian town, the world came alive with simple routines. Roosters crowed, donkeys brayed, and the streets filled with the sound of sandals slapping dust. In every courtyard, smoke drifted upward from clay ovens where flatbread baked for the morning meal. The smell of fresh bread mixed with the earthy scent of wet reeds carried in from the canals. Life for the Sumerians was shaped by cycles of water, of grain, of worship, A farmer's day began early. He walked barefoot along the levee, checking the irrigation channels that fed his fields. His children followed, carrying baskets of seed barley. With a wooden plough drawn by oxen, furrows were cut into the damp soil, and seed was dropped with care. Later in the season, entire families bent low to pull weeds and chase birds from the ripening crop. At harvest, men swung sickles made from flint and baked clay. Women bundled sheaves, and children gathered fallen heads of grain. The work was hard, but when the threshing floors filled with golden piles of barley, it felt like a victory given by the gods themselves. Women's lives were no less vital. In the courtyard, they ground grain on heavy stones, kneading dough for bread and brewing the thick barley beer that quenched thirst in the heat. They wove wool into cloth on upright looms, the rhythmic clack of shuttle and thread forming the music of the household. Mothers taught daughters to spin, to cook, to keep the fire alive. They also carried offerings to the household shrine, a tiny clay figure, perhaps, or a small jar of oil placed before the family's chosen god. Children grew up quickly. A boy might help herd goats, learning the calls that kept animals in line. A girl might fetch water from the well, balancing a jar against her hip. For a lucky few, the path led to the scribal school. There, under the stern eye of a master, boys copied wedge-shaped signs into clay tablets until their hands cramped. They learned to list goods, count rations, and eventually compose hymns and proverbs. Some tablets of students survive today, still marked with corrections in the margin, as if the voice of the teacher could be heard across the centuries. Do it again, and do it right. Festivals broke the rhythm of work. On holy days, people donned clean linen robes, adorned themselves with beads of carnelian or lapis, and joined processions to the temple. Musicians played lyres and drums. Dancers spun in circles. Priests chanted hymns to Inanna or Enlil. Sacrifices of bread, beer, and lamb were placed on the altar, the smoke curling into the air as prayers rose with it. For a few hours, the burdens of daily labor lifted, and the city became one body, united in song and ritual. Trade bound daily life to a wider world. Merchants loaded boats with surplus grain, wool, and pottery, steering them down the river to distant markets. In return came copper from Oman, timber from Lebanon, and shining stones from Afghanistan. Even ordinary people felt the touch of distant lands, a bead of lapis in a necklace, a cedar beam holding up the roof, a jug sealed with resin that smelled of foreign forests. The family home was the heart of Sumerian life. Built of mud brick, it opened inward to a shaded courtyard. Around the courtyard stood small rooms, one for sleeping, one for storage, one for the household shrine. At night, families gathered under oil lamps, telling stories while eating dates and bread. Sometimes they told tales of heroes who fought lions or wrestled giants. Other times they whispered prayers for health, rain, or the safe return of a son serving in the temple militia. Life was fragile. Illness struck without warning, and charms were worn against demons thought to bring fever or misfortune. Midwives whispered prayers during childbirth, and mourners poured water into graves to ease the spirits of the dead. Yet, despite danger, families endured, held together by duty and love. The strength of the city rested not only on its kings and temples, but on these unseen rhythms of daily life, on bread baked at dawn, canals mended at noon, songs sung at dusk. As night returned, the city quieted. The hum of insects filled the reeds. Dogs barked in distant alleys, and lamps flickered in doorways. In courtyards, families lay on mats beneath the stars, the sky stretching endless above the flat land. They slept to the murmur of rivers, to dreams of gods, to the promise that tomorrow would bring work, worship, and the steady pulse of life. Long before the scribes of Uruk carved lists of taxes or treaties, they pressed something even more enduring into clay stories. To the Sumerians, the world was alive with unseen forces. Every wind carried a god's breath. Every riverbank bore a spirit's mark. And every star was a doorway to divine order. In myths, they explained not only why floods came or why kings ruled, but why humans themselves existed at all. At the center of their pantheon stood An, the sky god, who embodied the vast heavens. Silent and distant, beside him was Enlil, the lord of air and storms. Powerful and temperamental, Enki, the god of wisdom and water, lived in the deep fresh waters beneath the earth. Clever and often mischievous, Inanna, radiant goddess of love and war, was perhaps the most beloved. Fierce, passionate, protector and destroyer in equal measure. Each city-state claimed a patron god or goddess. Ur honored Nanna, the moon god. Lagash held Ningirsu. Uruk gave its devotion to Inanna. Temples were not merely shrines, they were cosmic hubs where heaven and earth touched. Creation myths told how gods shaped men from clay, mixing mud with the blood of a slain deity. Humans, in this telling, were made for service, to irrigate, to build, to bring offerings, to relieve the gods of toil. It was not slavery, but a cosmic duty, an arrangement that explained why the fields had to be watered and why prayers had to be spoken each dawn. Life was fragile, and the gods were powerful to keep the world steady. One must honor the balance. The Sumerians also told of a great flood, long before the Hebrews or the Greeks. Their tablets spoke of a deluge sent by the gods to cleanse the earth. One man, Ziusudra, was warned to build a boat to save his family and animals. When the waters receded, he released a dove to test the land. It did not return. The tale would echo down the centuries, transformed in new tongues but still carrying the Sumerian seed. Among their myths, none has traveled further than the Epic of Gilgamesh. Though the story grew over centuries, its roots lay in Uruk, in memories of an ancient king whose deeds were so great they blurred into legend. Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, ruled with pride until the gods sent Enkidu, a wild man to challenge him. The two fought like lions. Yet their struggle ended in friendship. Together they slew Humbaba, guardian of the cedar forest, and the bull of heaven itself. But victory could not shield them from mortality. When Enkidu died, Gilgamesh wandered the earth, broken, searching for eternal life. His journey brought him to the immortal survivor of the flood, who told him the bitter truth: man is destined to die, and only his deeds and his stories endure. In those lines etched into clay nearly 5,000 years ago, the human voice trembles across time. The questions the Sumerians asked are still our own. Why must we die? Can love and friendship outlast death? What is the meaning of a life lived under the eyes of gods and time? In quiet courtyards and in the shadow of ziggurats, people heard these tales, and perhaps felt less alone in their own brief years upon the earth. Ritual and myth worked together. Each new year, the king enacted a sacred marriage with the high priestess of Inanna, symbolizing the union of heaven and earth, of fertility and abundance. Farmers watching barley rise from the fields believed their work was woven into the gods' favor. A soldier marching to war might whisper Inanna's name for courage, just as a mother in labor prayed to Ninhursag for safe delivery. Myth was not entertainment, it was the architecture of existence. Even the stars bore stories. Astronomer priests mapped the heavens, noting how planets wandered, how constellations marked seasons. They named the Pleiades, the bull of heaven, the lion. To them, the sky was not empty, but crowded with meaning, a reflection of the order on earth. As night fell over Sumerian cities, the myths were spoken again by priests chanting hymns, by mothers telling bedtime tales, by scribes pressing wedges into clay. The gods might be distant, but their presence filled every corner of life. And in shaping stories, the Sumerians gave the world something as lasting as brick or bronze, the first great mirror of human imagination. The story of Sumer is not only of temples and myths, but of rules. For when people gather by the tens of thousands, walls alone cannot hold them together. A city requires justice, and justice requires law. The Sumerians were among the first to write it down. In the beginning, disputes were settled in the temple courtyard. Two farmers might argue over a boundary washed away by the flood. A merchant might claim his debtor had failed to pay. Witnesses stood before priests, who prayed for guidance from the gods. Their decisions, spoken aloud, carried authority, but memory fades, and words can be twisted. So clay tablets became judges in their own right. They bore contracts of marriage, deeds of land, records of loans with interest carefully scratched into their surfaces. To press one's seal into clay was to bind oneself as firmly as if the gods themselves were watching. Kingship rose from this need for order. A king was not only a warrior, but a shepherd. Charged with protecting both field and flock, he commanded armies to defend canals from rival cities. But he also issued decrees to settle quarrels, to fix weights and measures, to ensure fairness in trade, in lists carved on clay. Scribes remembered names of kings stretching back into the mists. Enmeber-Agesi of Kish, who is said to have fought Elam. Lugal-Zagesi of who dreamed of uniting the land. Gilgamesh of Uruk, whose epic we still tell. To govern, kings relied on officials. There were tax collectors who measured grain, scribes who tracked labor for canal repairs, overseers who assigned workers to build the temple tower. Each role was written into clay, each man accountable by the wedge-shaped signs of cuneiform. Bureaucracy, that invisible web that binds vast numbers of people, was born along the Euphrates. Law codes appeared. One of the oldest, from King Ur-Nammu of Ur, set down principles we still recognize. Punishment should fit the crime. Compensation could restore balance. The strong must not crush the weak. Later, Hammurabi of Babylon would expand and refine these ideas. But the seed was Sumerian. Imagine a tablet declaring, "If a man knocks out the tooth of another, he shall pay 2 shekels of silver." Simple, clear, enduring. Justice had found a form that could be read by generations unborn. Religion remained interwoven with governance. A king did not rule by might alone. He was the chosen of the city's god. Before battle, he sought omens from the entrails of a sacrificed sheep or the flight of birds. Victories were celebrated as proof of divine favor. Defeats demanded confession and ritual to restore balance. The ziggurat was not only a temple, but also a symbol of authority. Its very height declared here the gods watch, and here the king serves as their steward. Diplomacy, too, was guided by tablets. Messengers carried clay letters sealed with the marks of kings. They arranged marriages between royal houses, exchanged gifts of lapis and timber, negotiated peace after bloody feuds. These records, found centuries later in dusty ruins, still carry the press of fingers long vanished. Justice was not perfect. The poor and enslaved bore heavier burdens, their testimony sometimes worth less than that of a noble. Yet even they found protection in law. A debt could be forgiven after a term of service. A runaway slave who reached the temple might find sanctuary. Within these limits, order held back chaos. Consider the alternative without law. Canals would be left to ruin. Fields would fail. Hunger would drive raids. And gods themselves would seem absent. With law, the people could breathe, plant, trade, and tell their stories. Civilization is fragile, yet it grows strongest when bound by fairness. As dusk fell in a Sumerian city, the courts emptied, and the king's attendants recorded the day's judgments. Merchants sealed contracts, families prayed at shrines, and children fell asleep under the steady rhythm of order. Clay tablets dried in storerooms, holding within them the weight of promises and the shape of justice. Thus, in Sumer, humanity first learned a truth we still live by, that a city is not only bricks and walls, not only fields and canals, but also trust written into law. And from that trust rises the possibility of peace. In the quiet of dawn, the fields along the canals seemed eternal, barley bending in the breeze, goats cropping reeds, smoke rising from hearths. Yet behind the peace of daily life lay a tension as old as the rivers themselves. For Sumer was never one land but many cities, each with its own god, its own temple, its own pride. Ur fought with Umma, Lagash eyed its neighbors' fields. Kish claimed authority over all. From these rivalries came one of the first truths of history where men build walls. Sooner or later, they test them. The quarrels often began with water. A canal cut upstream by Umma could starve the fields of Lagash. A flood control levee, raised too high, might drown a neighbor's crops. To the farmers whose lives depended on steady flow, such disputes were not abstract but immediate, a matter of bread or hunger, and when priests failed to resolve them, kings unsheathed bronze blades. The armies of Sumer were not vast in number, but they were organized. Soldiers marched in files, carrying long spears and shields of reed and hide. Others bore axes of copper or clubs capped with bitumen. Chariots, clumsy by later standards, rattled across the plains, pulled by wild asses. Their wheels solid wood. Drums beat the rhythm of advance, and the banner of the city's god flew high. To fight was to prove not only human courage but divine favor. If Lagash triumphed, it was Ningirsu, their war god, who had granted victory. If Ur fell, it was Nana, their moon god, who had turned his face away. One of the earliest inscriptions tells of King Eonatum of Lagash, who in the 25th century BC carved his triumph upon a stele of stone. It shows lines of soldiers marching in tight formation, spears bristling like a forest, trampling enemies beneath their feet. It was not only a record, but a warning. This is what happens when neighbors challenge the will of our God. The stele itself became law in stone. Memory sharpened into intimidation, yet wars rarely ended forever. One city might rise to brief dominance, only to be humbled in the next generation. Kish claimed to be king of the world, yet soon bowed to Uruk. Ur built shining temples, yet soon felt the spears of Umma. Each victory was fragile, like silt reshaped by flood. Power flowed through Mesopotamia as water flowed through canals redirected. Stolen, fought over endlessly, and with war came cost. Fields lay untended when men marched. Canals cracked when workers carried spears instead of baskets. Families mourned sons who did not return. The gods demanded offerings even in defeat, and priests searched the heavens for omens to explain loss. A lunar eclipse might mean the king's days were numbered. The flight of birds might predict whether the next battle would bring triumph or ruin. In this crucible, weapons and tactics evolved. Bronze replaced copper, its edge sharper, its weight more deadly. Helmets of leather and metal began to appear. Fortifications thickened, city walls rising higher, gates reinforced with timber and bronze bands. But no wall could keep peace forever. When one gate closed, another was battered down. Yet, amid the cycle of rivalry, something else stirred. The people of Sumer began to imagine unity, not merely one city against another, but a land joined under a single rule. Lugal-Zajazi of Umma proclaimed himself king of all Sumer, a claim as ambitious as it was brief. Soon he fell to a greater conqueror, Sargon of Akkad, who marched from the north and forged the world's first empire upon the bones of Sumer's quarrels. But that is another tale. For in this moment, at the height of Sumer's own wars, we pause at a cliff's edge. A farmer stands at his canal, wondering whether tomorrow he will water his barley or bury his son. A soldier sharpens his spear, knowing that the gods may decide his fate before nightfall. And in the temple, a priest burns incense, praying that order will outlast chaos. Civilization had been born, but it trembled in the cradle of war. The very cities that built writing, law, and myth also tore at each other's walls. In that tension lies the paradox of Sumer, the oldest civilization, brilliant yet fragile, always on the verge of greatness and collapse. When spears were sheathed and canals repaired, Sumer returned to its quieter genius, the urge to measure, to shape, to understand. For though their cities fought, their minds reached for order in stars, numbers, and form. Out of clay and curiosity, the Sumerians carved the first deep channels of art and science. Their art was not merely decoration but devotion. On the temple walls, mosaics of shell, lapis, and red stone glittered in patterns of kings and priests, of lions tamed and gods enthroned. Tiny cylinder seals, no larger than a thumb, carried astonishing detail. Banquets, battles, processions that unrolled into endless stories across clay tablets. Each seal was both signature and miniature world, pressed with a twist into soft clay to say, "This is mine, and I was here." Music filled their courtyards. Harps strung with gut, lyres adorned with golden bull heads, and flutes cut from reeds gave rhythm to feasts and rituals. Scholars today have reconstructed some of these instruments, and when their strings are plucked, the notes echo across 5 millennia. Eerily familiar, perhaps in a courtyard of Ur. A mother once hummed the same melody, now heard in a modern hall. But art was only one measure of their brilliance. The Sumerians also turned to the heavens. Night after night, priests climbed temple terraces to watch the sky. They charted the paths of stars and planets, noting how the moon's phases governed tides, how constellations marked the turning of seasons. From their patient watching came the first calendars, months divided by moons, years by harvests, festivals timed to celestial rhythms. Their mathematics shaped the very structure of time. 60 was their sacred number, a base that divided evenly into many parts. From it, we inherited minutes and seconds, circles of 360 degrees, measures that still tick in our clocks and guide our compasses. A Sumerian scribe, scratching numbers into clay, unknowingly set the standard for every navigator and mathematician to follow. In medicine, too, they sought order in chaos. Illness was seen as both physical and divine, caused by spirits, yet treated with herbs, oils, and incantations. Clay tablets record remedies for fever. Crush willow bark in water. Others prescribe charms. Hang a bead of lapis at the throat to drive away the demon of cough. Primitive, perhaps, yet also the first attempt to systematize healing, to record cures instead of trusting only to memory. Architecture carried their visions skyward. Ziggurats rose step by step, vast platforms layered in brick, each tier smaller than the one below, They were mountains made by men on plains without stone, binding earth and heaven in one form. From their heights, priests watched stars. Kings offered sacrifice, and people saw in mud brick the reflection of eternity. Science and art also served power. Kings commissioned statues of themselves with clasped hands, eyes wide, gazing forever in worship. Engineers dug canals that turned deserts into bread baskets. Their angles measured with rope and stake. Surveyors stretched cords across fields, counting paces to fix boundaries. Justice was easier when lines were straight, when measures were fair. Yet behind every advance lay the human touch. Imagine a scribe hunched over a tablet, carefully adding rows of wedges to tally a merchant's grain. He sighs as the lamp smokes, rubbing clay from his fingers, unaware that his arithmetic will outlast empires, or a mason laying one more brick on a temple wall. Sweat, dripping, believing he labors for the gods, but in truth, building a legacy for all humanity. The Sumerians sought to bring pattern to a world of floods and feuds. In their art, they captured beauty. In their science, they measured the cosmos. In their laws, they tamed human quarrels. Each effort was an answer to uncertainty, the flood that might come, the enemy that might march, the sickness that might strike. Civilization was their shield, and knowledge its sharpest edge. When night fell and torches flickered along the streets of Uruk or Ur, people looked upward. The stars wheeled silently, but in those lights the Sumerians read meaning. To them, the heavens were not chaos, but script, written by gods and slowly deciphered by men. And in that act of reading, they gave the world its first grammar of order. If the fields of barley were Sumer's heart, its trade was the bloodstream. Along dusty roads and winding rivers, goods flowed in and out of the cities, carrying with them ideas, stories, and a faint sense of the wider world. Sumer was not isolated. It was the hub of a network stretching from mountains to seas. The rivers were highways. Flat-bottomed boats drifted down the Euphrates, laden with sacks of grain and jars of beer. Upstream, boatmen sang as they pushed against the current with poles, their vessels heavy with copper or stone. At quayside markets, crowds gathered as goods were unloaded, wool in great bundles, reeds tied into rafts, dried fish stacked in baskets. The air was alive with haggling, the clatter of jars, the bleating of goats being driven to new owners. Yet Sumer lacked many resources, and need drove exchange. Timber for roofs and beams was scarce on the flat plain. It came from cedar forests in Lebanon. Copper for tools and weapons arrived from the mountains of Oman and Anatolia. Tin, rarer still, traveled from far beyond to mix with copper into the bronze that shaped an age. Lapis lazuli, the deep blue stone, gleamed on necklaces and seals, but its source lay in distant Afghanistan, carried across deserts by caravans whose names are lost to us. Each object in a Sumerian home carried the weight of long journeys and countless hands. Merchants became bridges between worlds. They were practical men, skilled in barter, often multilingual, carrying not only goods, but also news. One might return from the Persian Gulf with rumors of strange fish. Another from the Zagros Mountains with tales of fierce tribes. To trade was to stretch imagination as well as profit. A woman in Ur might hold a bead of carnelian and marvel that it came from lands beyond the sunrise. The temple and the palace watched over commerce. Priests kept storerooms where merchants deposited goods, taking receipts in clay. The king's officials fixed weights and measures to prevent cheating. Silver gradually became a standard of value. Not coins, but measured lumps or rings, exchanged with careful weighing. Even in these early days, economy carried both trust and tension. Trust that seals would hold. Tension when debts went unpaid. Caravans crossed the dry plains. Donkeys carried loads on wooden frames, their bells jingling as they moved in lines stretching to the horizon. Guards marched beside them, spears ready, for the open land was home to raiders. At night, fires lit the camps. Merchants shared beer and gossip, and stars turned above the flat world. By dawn, the caravan was moving again, inching wealth across deserts and mountains. Seafaring, too, played its part. From the ports of southern Mesopotamia, ships of bitumen-sealed wood sailed down the Gulf, hugging coastlines, carrying grain and wool in exchange for copper, shells, and stone. Their sails were square, their voyages uncertain, but they stitched together distant shores. To stand on a dock at Ur and watch a ship vanish into the horizon was to feel the pull of mystery, the sense that Sumer was not alone, but part of something vast. Trade changed daily life. A craftsman in Lagash carved ivory, brought from far-off lands. A bride in Uruk wore a necklace of beads strung from 3 continents. A child played with a shell that once lay in an Indian Ocean lagoon. Through such objects, the world whispered at Sumer's doors, promising both wonder and risk. But commerce carried fragility as well as fortune. A disrupted caravan meant empty workshops. A raided ship meant shortages in the market. And with every deal, inequality grew. Merchants amassed wealth. Priests demanded shares. Debt bound the poor. For some, prosperity meant larger homes. For others, servitude. Still, the network endured. Sumerian traders carried not only goods but also ideas, writing, myth, measures of time. Their influence spread into Elam, Akkad, and beyond, laying threads that later civilizations would weave into their own. Even after Sumer's cities fell, echoes of its trade routes remained, like footprints pressed into the clay of history. As dusk fell in Ur, markets closed. Seals were pressed into clay envelopes, and merchants counted their silver somewhere beyond the horizon. Another caravan was already setting out, another ship raising its sail. And thus the lifeblood of Sumer continued, binding the oldest civilization to a world it helped create. When the last fires dimmed in Sumer's cities, their walls crumbled and canals filled with silt, yet their voices did not vanish. They lingered in clay, in myths carried forward, in habits so ordinary we forget their origin. The Sumerians, though conquered, still whisper to us. The Epic of Gilgamesh survived not only in Uruk, but in Akkadian libraries centuries later. On baked tablets, the tale of the restless king and his lost friend traveled beyond Sumer, carried into Babylon, where scribes copied it with devotion. Its flood story reappeared in new tongues in Hebrew scripture, in Greek myths, in countless retellings that still echo today. When we read of heroes seeking immortality or of floods cleansing the earth, we are reading Sumer's dreams, refracted through time. Law, too, bore their imprint. The code of Ur-Nammu became the ancestor of Hammurabi's stele, which in turn inspired traditions of justice across the ancient Near East. The idea that disputes could be settled by written rule rather than raw power took root here. Each time a court weighs evidence or a contract seals a bargain. A shadow of Sumer's clay tablets lies beneath the parchment and screen, their mathematics and astronomy stretched further still. Dividing hours into 60 minutes, circles into 360 degrees. They gave the world tools of measurement that remain untouched by time. Astronomers in Babylon, Greek philosophers, Islamic scholars all inherited Sumer's patient watching of the heavens. Even today, when clocks strike noon or a navigator plots a course by compass, the Sumerian base 6-0 hums quietly in the background. From their myths arose moral reflections. Do not speak arrogantly to your mother, she gave you birth. The poor man is the silent man. Such proverbs, pressed into clay, remind us that even in the oldest civilization, people grappled with humility, duty, and compassion. In their hymns, gods demanded justice for widows and orphans, showing that alongside the harshness of war and flood, there was tenderness in their vision of order. The Hebrews, exiled centuries later in Babylon, listened to stories that bore Sumerian roots. From them, fragments slipped into scripture gardens of creation, towers reaching the sky, floods that swallowed the earth. Assyria and Babylon, though conquerors, built upon Sumer's foundation, adapting their gods, refining their law, amplifying their science. To live in Mesopotamia was always to walk in Sumer's shadow. Whether one admitted it or not, even silence preserves them. In storerooms uncovered by archaeologists, tablets lie stacked like forgotten books. Some are school exercises, filled with clumsy signs from tired students. Others are receipts for grain, names of shepherds, tallies of fish. They were never meant to last 5,000 years. Yet they remain, fragile yet legible. Proof that the simplest acts of record-keeping can outlast empires. Consider, too, the very idea of the city. Streets, marketplaces, taxes, officials, walls. These were born in Sumer and spread outward. To walk in New York, Cairo, or Tokyo is to see the descendant of Uruk's crowded lanes, the hum of commerce, the weight of bureaucracy. The anonymity of urban life all began when Sumerians gathered beyond the scale of clan or tribe and invented the city as we know it. And what of their gods? Though the temples fell, their stories endured. Inanna became Ishtar in Babylon. then Astarte among the Canaanites, then Aphrodite in Greece. Enki became Ea, wise counselor of the gods. Myths reshaped themselves, but their bones remained Sumerian. Across centuries, love and war, wisdom and flood, still bore their ancient marks. Sumer's end was not a sudden silence, but a slow blending. Akkadians conquered. Babylonians inherited. Assyrians ruled. Yet, beneath each layer, the first voices remained. Civilization is rarely erased. It is absorbed. Its clay reused. Its myths retold. Its numbers repeated. Sumer was not merely the oldest civilization. It was the root of the tree whose branches cover our world. Tonight, as we remember them, it is worth pausing at the thought that the very act of remembering writing down words, preserving them beyond breath, is Sumerian. Their stylus pressed into clay has become our pen on paper, our hands on keys, our voices recorded in digital light. In this way, the Sumerians never truly vanished. They speak whenever we measure, whenever we record, whenever we dream of gods and heroes. Every dawn in Mesopotamia once promised eternity. The ziggurats stood tall, the canals shimmered, and scribes pressed their wedges into clay with the confidence that the world would go on as it always had. But nothing human lasts forever. The land that had nurtured the first cities also carried within it the seeds of decline. The soil itself began to betray them. Year after year, water drawn from the rivers left behind salt in the fields. At first it was unnoticed, then tolerated, then feared. Barley grew thinner, dates less sweet, harvests less certain. Farmers who once filled temple storerooms now watched their fields whiten with salt crust. Some abandoned their plots, drifting toward cities already strained with mouths to feed. The cradle of civilization was slowly choking on its own abundance. Wars hastened the weakening. City fought city until neither had strength to resist outsiders. Armies from Elam pressed in from the east, their banners strange to Sumerian eyes. From the north came Akkadians, led by Sargon, who forged an empire on the ruins of Sumer's rivalries. Uruk and Ur still shone for a time, but their independence was swallowed. Proud kings became governors. Temples bowed to foreign rulers, and the old order cracked. Nature added its blows. Drought swept the land in waves. Canals dried. Reeds shriveled, and caravans faltered. Without steady water, cities shrank. Once mighty walls crumbled under neglect. Families fled, carrying what little grain they could, seeking refuge in stronger kingdoms rising around them. Even the gods seemed silent, their temples echoing with unanswered prayers. Yet decline was not destruction alone. In their last centuries, Sumerians blended with Akkadians, sharing language, law, and myth. Cuneiform was copied into new tongues. Inanna became Ishtar. Enki became Ea. Their culture survived not as a single flame, but as sparks carried into new fires. Babylon and Assyria built upon their foundations, reshaping what they inherited. But always, however faint, the Sumerian voice remained. Archaeologists today find traces of that twilight. A tablet recording unpaid debts, abandoned mid-sentence, a half-finished wall left to weather, skeletons in collapsed houses, buried beneath the silt of floods. Each fragment whispers of a people caught between memory and oblivion. And yet, perhaps, they would not have called it an ending. To the Sumerians, cycles ruled all things flood and drought, night and day, planting and harvest. What rose must fall, what fell would rise again in another form. Just as the moon god Nana waxed and waned, so too would cities. In their myths, immortality was denied to men. But memory endured. That truth became their legacy. The fall of Sumer was not the erasure of a people, but the transformation of a civilization. Their language faded, their kings forgotten, but their inventions, writing, law, city life, myth flowed onward, absorbed by neighbors, reborn in later empires, even as Ur's last ziggurat crumbled. Its shape echoed in Babylon's towers, in Assyria's palaces, and millennia later, in every city that dares to build toward the sky. So the world's first civilization passed into history, not with one final battle, nor with one last flood, but with a long surrender to time, war, and salt. Their greatness dissolved into the soil, yet their voice pressed into clay, etched into myth, still speaks. Stand in the ruins of Ur today, where desert winds sweep over fallen bricks. And you may feel it. The silence is heavy, but not empty. Beneath the dust lies the memory of a people who first dreamed of cities, who first measured the heavens, who first wrote their words to outlast death. Their fall was real, but so is their survival in us, who live still within the world they began. The rivers still run. The Tigris and Euphrates continue to braid their way across the plain, carrying silt and memory. Their waters no longer feed the canals of Uruk or Lagash, yet they trace the same restless paths, reminding us that time flows as steadily as water. Where once stood ziggurats, there are mounds of earth. Where once scribes pressed clay, the desert winds whisper through broken walls. And yet, in the silence of ruins, the Sumerians still speak. They speak through every clock that measures 60 minutes to an hour, every compass that circles 360 degrees. They speak in every city that rises with crowded streets, in every contract that binds two strangers, in every written word that survives beyond the breath of its author. They speak in stories of floods, of gods, of kings who sought immortality. When we tell tales of human longing and loss, we retell the questions first asked in Uruk. Civilization did not begin with marble or iron, but with mud, brick, and clay. It was fragile, uncertain, often shaken by flood or spear, yet from that fragility came endurance. The Sumerians taught the world that memory could be preserved, that law could tame chaos, that myth could guide meaning. They showed that even in a world of hunger and war, beauty could be carved into stone, music strung across strings, wisdom pressed into clay. We live in towers of steel and glass. But their shape is not so distant from the ziggurats of old. Our books and screens are more advanced than clay tablets. Yet they serve the same dream to remember, to share, to outlast. The Sumerians, though gone, are not absent. They are woven into the fabric of our days, into the rhythms of time, the patterns of trade, the cadence of story. And so, as night settles, imagine the plain long ago, the stars wheel silently above. A priest climbs the temple steps with an offering. A farmer closes the gate of his canal. A child, drowsy under the desert sky, listens to a tale of Gilgamesh. The voices fade. The lamps go out. But the story continues, carried across 5,000 years to you. Here, tonight, close your eyes. The rivers still flow. The clay still holds its marks. And the world's first civilization still whispers in the dark. Sleep now. To the memory of Sumer, the oldest of them all.